The old Victorian mansion stood silent in the morning mist, its weathered brick walls holding secrets of generations past. Inside, Catherine Morrison sat perfectly still in her favorite armchair, the same one her grandmother had brought from England nearly a century ago. At 87 years old, she possessed a grace that time had only enhanced, her silver hair swept back in an elegant bun, her eyes still bright with the wisdom of a life fully lived. Thomas Whitfield adjusted his easel for the third time that morning. The renowned portrait artist had painted presidents, movie stars, and captains of industry, but something about this commission felt different. Perhaps it was the way Catherine had contacted him through her granddaughter Emma, insisting he was the only artist who could capture what she called the essence beneath the surface. "You're nervous," Catherine observed, her voice carrying the soft accent of old Boston society. She watched him arrange his brushes with trembling hands. "That's unusual for someone of your reputation." Thomas paused, meeting her gaze. In 30 years of painting portraits, he had learned to read people quickly, to see past their public facades. But Catherine Morrison was different. Behind her serene expression lay something profound, something that seemed to shimmer just beyond his perception. "There's something about you, Mrs. Morrison," he admitted, setting down his palette knife. "I can't quite place it." She smiled, the kind of smile that suggested she knew things others didn't. "Perhaps that's why I chose you, Mr. Whitfield. You see what others miss." The Morrison estate had been in the family for 5 generations. Catherine had lived there her entire life, watching the city grow around it, watching the world change from her windows. She had married here, raised her children here, and buried her husband in the small family cemetery near the Rose Garden. Every room held memories, every painting on the wall told a story. Emma, her granddaughter, bustled in with a tea service, her modern business suit contrasting sharply with the antique surroundings. At 28, she was a successful lawyer in the city, but she made time every week to visit her grandmother. Lately, those visits had become more frequent. "Gran, you should rest," Emma said, setting down the silver tray. "We can continue the portrait tomorrow." "No, dear," Catherine replied firmly. "Today is the day. I feel it in my bones." Thomas noticed the look that passed between grandmother and granddaughter, a mixture of understanding and unspoken sorrow. He had seen that look before, in families where time was precious and numbered. As he began to sketch, Catherine started to speak. Her voice was steady, almost hypnotic, as she recounted stories from her youth. She spoke of dancing at the Copley Plaza during the war, of meeting her husband James at a Red Cross benefit, of the telegram that almost ended everything before it began. "James was supposed to ship out to Normandy," she said, her fingers tracing the pearl necklace at her throat, the same pearls James had given her on their wedding day. "But his orders were changed at the last minute. His entire unit, they didn't make it. He carried that survivor's guilt his whole life." The morning light shifted, casting new shadows across Catherine's face. Thomas worked quickly, his trained eye catching every nuance, every line that told a story. But there was something else he was capturing, something he couldn't quite name. "Tell me about the children," Thomas prompted, needing her to keep talking. The sound of her voice seemed to guide his brush in ways he didn't fully understand. Catherine's expression softened. "3 beautiful souls," she said. "Margaret, our eldest, became a doctor. She works with Doctors Without Borders now, saving lives in places I can barely pronounce. Robert, our middle child, he's a teacher. Special education. He has such patience, such love for those children. And then, there's David." Her voice caught slightly. David had been killed in Vietnam, 3 days before his tour ended. His photograph sat on the mantel, forever young, forever smiling in his dress uniform. "David was going to be an artist," she continued. "Like you, Mr. Whitfield. He saw beauty everywhere, even in that terrible place. His last letter, he wrote about the sunrise over the jungle, how it reminded him of the light through the stained glass windows at St. Mary's." Thomas felt his throat tighten. He mixed his colors carefully, finding in the oils the exact shade of strength and sorrow that played across Catherine's features. The portrait was taking shape now, but it was unlike anything he had painted before. There was a luminescence to it, a quality that seemed to come from within the canvas itself.
Emma checked her watch and frowned. Gran, Dr. Peterson will be here soon for your appointment.
Cancel it, Catherine said simply.
But, Gran Emma, dear, some things are more important than appointments.
The young woman's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away.
She nodded and quietly left the room. Catherine turned back to Thomas.
Do you believe in purpose, Mr. Whitfield? That we're each here for specific reasons?
I never used to, Thomas admitted, adding another layer to the canvas. But, the older I get, the more I wonder.
I've lived a good life, Catherine said.
A full life.
I've loved deeply, lost profoundly, and found joy in unexpected places.
But, do you know what I'm most proud of?
Thomas shook his head, his brush never stopping its movement.
The connections, she said. The lives I've touched, the love I've shared. My children, my grandchildren, my students from when I taught school.
Even the strangers I've met briefly who needed a kind word or a helping hand.
We're all connected, you see.
Every action, every word, every gesture creates ripples that extend far beyond what we can see. The room had grown warm with the afternoon sun. Thomas was sweating, but he didn't dare stop. The portrait was almost complete, and he sensed that time was crucial. Catherine's face on the canvas seemed to glow with an inner light, her eyes holding depths of wisdom and compassion that he had somehow managed to capture. There's a story, Catherine continued, about my great-grandmother.
She was a painter too, though women artists weren't taken seriously in her day.
She painted portraits of everyone in the household, family, servants, everyone. She believed that every person deserved to be remembered, to have their story told. She gestured to the walls around them, where dozens of portraits hung in ornate frames. These are her work. 5 generations of lives, all connected, all part of the same continuing story.
Thomas stepped back to look at his work.
The portrait was nearly finished, but something was still missing. He couldn't identify what it was, but he knew it wasn't complete.
May I ask you something personal, he said. Catherine nodded. Why was it so important that I paint this portrait today?
She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant.
Have you ever felt when something is ending, Mr. Whitfield? Not in a sad way, but in a complete way? Like a book reaching its final chapter?
Thomas's hand stilled. He looked at the elderly woman, really looked at her, and, suddenly, understood. The luminescence he had been seeing wasn't his imagination. There was a quality to Catherine that spoke of transition, of standing at a threshold.
You're not ill, he said. It wasn't a question.
No, she agreed.
I'm not ill. I'm complete.
The weight of her words settled over the room like a benediction.
Thomas returned to his easel with renewed purpose. He knew now what the portrait was missing.
As the afternoon sun began to sink lower, casting golden light through the tall windows, Catherine continued her stories. She spoke of her work during the civil rights movement, of marching despite her husband's fears for her safety. She talked about opening their home to young people who had been cast out by their own families, about the scholarship fund she had quietly maintained for decades. Every life has meaning, she said. Every person has a story worth telling.
That's what I want this portrait to capture, Mr. Whitfield.
Not just my face, but the truth that we're all part of something larger, something beautiful. Thomas worked in a kind of trance now, his brushstrokes guided by something beyond technique.
The portrait on his easel was transforming into something extraordinary.
Catherine's face seemed to hold all the faces of those she had loved, all the lives she had touched. There was a universality to it, a quality that spoke to the shared human experience.
Emma returned as the shadows grew long.
She took one look at the portrait and gasped, her hand flying to her mouth.
Gran, she whispered. It's perfect. Catherine rose from her chair with effort, Emma rushing to steady her.
Together, they approached the easel. For a long moment, Catherine studied her portrait in silence. Yes, she finally said, her voice filled with satisfaction.
Yes, this is right. This is what I wanted to leave behind. Thomas felt drained but exhilarated.
In all his years as an artist, he had never created anything quite like this. The portrait seemed to pulse with life, with love, with the accumulated wisdom of a life well lived. "There's one more thing," Catherine said, turning to him. "I want you to paint something else into the portrait. Something that won't be visible to everyone, but those who need to see it will." She whispered something to him, her words meant only for the artist's ears. Thomas nodded, understanding flooding through him. He picked up his finest brush and added a few delicate strokes to the canvas, barely visible, but there for those who looked closely enough. As the last light of day faded from the room, the portrait was complete. Catherine stood before it, her real face and her painted face both glowing with the same inner light. "Thank you," she said to Thomas, taking his paint-stained hands in hers. "You've given me the greatest gift an artist can give. You've seen me truly, and you've helped others to see as well." That night, Catherine insisted Thomas stay for dinner. They ate in the formal dining room, surrounded by the portraits of her ancestors, the conversation flowing as freely as the wine. Catherine was more animated than she had been all day, sharing stories that had her granddaughter laughing through her tears. As Thomas prepared to leave, Catherine handed him an envelope. "Your payment," she said. "And a little something extra." "Mrs. Morrison, I couldn't." "You can and you will," she said firmly. "Use it to paint others, Mr. Whitfield. Find the people whose stories need to be told. That's all I ask." He left the Morrison estate that night feeling changed. The portrait, carefully wrapped, sat in the back of his van. He had created many works of art in his career, but he knew this one was different. This one had a purpose beyond decoration or documentation. Catherine stood at her bedroom window, watching his taillights disappear into the night. Emma stood beside her, their hands clasped. "Are you afraid, Gran?" Emma asked softly. "No, dear one," Catherine replied. "I'm curious. Death is just another doorway, and I've always loved discovering what's on the other side of doors." They stood together in comfortable silence, a house around them filled with the memories and love of generations. "Will you make sure the portrait goes where it needs to?" Catherine asked. "Of course," Emma promised. "Where should it go?" Catherine smiled that mysterious smile again. "You'll know when the time comes. The portrait will tell you." As she prepared for bed that night, Catherine felt a deep sense of peace. Her story had been told, captured in oils and canvas by an artist who understood that a portrait could be more than just a likeness. It could be a testament, a teaching, a bridge between souls. She sat at her writing desk and penned one last letter, sealing it with wax and her family ring. The letter was addressed simply, "To whoever needs to read this." Then, Catherine Morrison went to bed for the last time, her heart full of love and completion, knowing that her portrait would continue to touch lives long after she was gone. Emma found her grandmother the next morning, peaceful in her bed, the morning light streaming through the lace curtains just as Catherine had always loved. There was no struggle, no sign of distress. She had simply stepped through that doorway she had spoken of, as gracefully as she had lived. The house felt different without Catherine's presence, as if it too was in mourning. Emma moved through the rooms in a daze, making the necessary phone calls, handling the arrangements. But her mind kept returning to the portrait, still wrapped in the parlor where Thomas had left it. Margaret arrived first, flying in from Sudan where she had been working in a refugee camp. Her face was weathered by sun and marked by the weight of the suffering she witnessed daily, but her eyes, Catherine's eyes, were still fierce with compassion. She knew, Margaret said simply when Emma told her about their grandmother's final day. "She always knew things before the rest of us." Robert came next, bringing with him 3 of his special education students who had insisted on paying their respects. Catherine had visited his classroom every month, reading stories and teaching the children to paint. "Mrs. C was our favorite," said Marcus, a boy with Down syndrome who clutched a painting he had made of Catherine surrounded by butterflies. "She said everyone could be an artist." The funeral was set for 3 days later, but first, the family gathered to unwrap the portrait. They stood in a semicircle in the parlor, the same room where Thomas had painted it, as Emma carefully removed the protective covering. The collective gasp that rose from the family was audible. The portrait seemed to glow in the afternoon light, Catherine's face radiating warmth and wisdom. But it was more than just a likeness, it was as if her very essence had been captured and preserved. "Look at her eyes," Robert whispered. "It's like she's still here, watching over us." Margaret stepped closer, studying the painting with her physician's attention to detail. "There's something else," she said. "Look closely, in the corner of her smile, in the light reflected in her eyes." They all leaned in, and, slowly, they began to see it, the subtle additional strokes Thomas had added at Catherine's request. Almost invisible unless you knew to look for them, were tiny figures, people helping people, hands reaching out to other hands, an infinite chain of human connection extending beyond the borders of the canvas. "My God," Emma breathed. "It's everyone. It's all of us." The funeral drew hundreds of people. The church couldn't hold them all, they spilled out onto the steps and into the street. Former students, now grandparents themselves, came to pay their respects. Young people whose lives Catherine had saved with her quiet intervention stood shoulder to shoulder with city officials and society matrons. But it was the unexpected visitors who truly showed the reach of Catherine's influence. A homeless veteran whom she had helped get back on his feet. A young mother who had been one of the teenagers Catherine had taken in decades ago. An artist who had received an anonymous scholarship that had changed his life, only learning at the funeral that Catherine had been his benefactor. The portrait was displayed at the front of the church, and, throughout the service, people couldn't help but glance at it. There was something about it that drew the eye, that seemed to offer comfort to those who were grieving. Father Michael, who had known Catherine for 40 years, spoke of her radical compassion. "Catherine Morrison understood a fundamental truth," he said. "That we are all connected, all part of the same human family." She lived this truth every day, in ways small and large. She didn't just preach love, she practiced it, consistently, quietly, powerfully. After the service, as people filed past the portrait to pay their respects, something extraordinary began to happen. Person after person stopped, stared, and, then, began to weep, not just tears of sorrow, but tears of recognition, of understanding, of transformation. "I see it," one woman whispered. "I see what she wanted us to see." Thomas Whitfield stood at the back of the church, watching the effect his painting was having. He had arrived late, slipping in quietly, not wanting to draw attention to himself. But he needn't have worried, all eyes were on the portrait. A young man approached him, somehow recognizing the artist. "You painted her," he said. It wasn't a question. Thomas nodded. "I'm Danny Chen. Mrs. Morrison paid for my art school when my family couldn't afford it. I never got to thank her properly." His voice broke. "That portrait, it's not just her, is it? It's all of us. Everyone she touched." "She told me to paint what was true," Thomas replied. "This is what I saw." As the days passed, word of the portrait spread. The Morrison family had decided to display it in the house for a week, allowing anyone who wished to come and pay their respects. The stream of visitors was constant. A psychology professor from Harvard came to study it, fascinated by the reported effects it was having on viewers. "There's something happening here that goes beyond normal art appreciation," she told Emma. "People are having profound emotional experiences. They're leaving changed." Emma, as executor of her grandmother's estate, found herself overwhelmed by the decisions that needed to be made. The house, the possessions, the investments, Catherine had left detailed instructions for most things, but, about the portrait, she had only written, "Let it go where it's needed." "What does that even mean?" Emma asked her aunt and uncle over dinner a week after the funeral. Margaret set down her wineglass thoughtfully. "You know how Gran was. She never did anything without purpose. Maybe we need to wait and see where it's meant to go." As if an answer to her words, Emma's phone rang. It was Dr. Patricia Hendricks from the Morrison Cancer Center, the wing at the hospital that Catherine had quietly funded for 20 years. "I'm sorry to bother you," Dr. Hendricks said, "but I wanted to share something. We've had 3 patients this week ask if they could see Mrs. Morrison's portrait. They heard about it from other patients. I know this is an odd request, but would you consider loaning it to the hospital for a while?" Emma looked at her family. Without hesitation, they all nodded. The portrait was installed in the meditation room at the cancer center, a quiet space where patients and families could find solace. The effect was immediate and profound. Sarah Martinez was the first to experience what the staff would later call the Catherine effect. A single mother of 3, she was facing her second round of chemotherapy with diminishing hope. She sat before the portrait in the early morning, when the meditation room was empty, and stared into Catherine's painted eyes. "I don't know what happened," she later told her nurse. "I was looking at the painting, and, suddenly, I felt held. Like my grandmother was there with me. But it was more than that. I saw myself in the painting, not literally, but I understood that I was part of something larger. That my fight mattered, not just for me, but for everyone connected to me." Sarah's story was not unique. Patient after patient reported similar experiences. Some found courage they didn't know they had. Others discovered peace with situations they couldn't change. A few claimed to have received specific insights or messages, always exactly what they needed to hear. Dr. Hendricks, a woman of science, struggled to explain what was happening. "I've seen the power of art in healing," she told her colleagues. "But this is something different. It's as if the portrait is a conduit for something, call it love, call it universal consciousness, call it God. I don't know. I just know it's helping people in ways our medicine can't." Word of the portrait's presence at the hospital spread. People began coming from other cities, other states, to sit before it. The hospital had to institute viewing hours and time limits to manage the crowds. But it wasn't just cancer patients who came. Anyone facing loss, transition, or difficult decisions seemed drawn to the portrait. A CEO wrestling with laying off employees. A teenager contemplating suicide. A couple on the brink of divorce. They came, they sat, they looked into Catherine's painted eyes, and they left changed. Emma visited the portrait weekly, both to check on it and to sit with her grandmother's image. On one of these visits, she met Michael O'Brien, a hospice worker who had become something of a regular. "I bring my patients here when they're able," he explained. "The ones who are approaching the end. Your grandmother's portrait, it helps them see death differently. Not as an ending, but as a transformation." She said something similar the day she died, Emma shared. She called it a doorway. Michael nodded. "I've been doing this work for 15 years. I've seen a lot of death, a lot of fear. But the people who spend time with this portrait, they find a kind of grace. They start talking about connection, about how their lives have mattered, about the love they're leaving behind." 3 months after Catherine's death, Emma received a call from the Smithsonian. They had heard about the portrait and its unusual effects. Would the family consider donating it to the National Portrait Gallery? The family met to discuss it. The offer was prestigious, would secure the painting's place in history. But Margaret voiced what they were all thinking. Gran wouldn't want it in a museum, not yet. It's doing work at the hospital. It's helping people. Robert agreed. Remember what she said? Let it go where it's needed. Right now, it's needed at the cancer center. But the portrait story was far from over. Articles began appearing in newspapers and magazines. The miracle portrait, some called it, though the Morrison family cringed at the sensationalism. Social media spread stories of encounters with the painting, each one adding to its mystique. Thomas Whitfield found himself inundated with requests for interviews, for new commissions from people hoping to capture similar magic. He turned them all down. "I didn't create what's happening," he told a persistent journalist. "I just painted what I saw. Catherine Morrison was the miracle, not me." 6 months after Catherine's death, something unexpected happened. A teenager named Amy Wu attempted to vandalize the portrait. She had lost her mother to cancer and came to the hospital filled with rage at a world that would display beauty in a place of such suffering. Security reached her before she could damage the painting, but, instead of pressing charges, Emma asked to meet with her. Amy sat in the meditation room, sullenly staring at the floor, refusing to look at the portrait. "It's cruel," she said. "Putting that here. That woman with her perfect life, looking all serene while people are dying.
Emma sat quietly for a moment. "Tell me about your mother," she said.
For the next hour, Amy talked about her mother's illness, about feeling alone, about the unfairness of it all. Emma listened without judgment, occasionally sharing her own experiences of loss. Finally, Amy looked up at the portrait, really looked at it for the first time. Her angry expression slowly shifted to one of wonder. "She lost people too," Amy said softly. "I can see it. She knew what this feels like." "Her son died in Vietnam," Emma confirmed. "Her husband died of cancer. She lost her parents young."
"But, look at her face, Amy. What do you see?" Amy studied the portrait for a long moment.
"She's not pretending it didn't hurt," she said finally. "But, she found a way to make something beautiful from it." That encounter changed Amy's life. She began volunteering at the hospital, sitting with patients who had no visitors, sharing her story with other grieving teenagers. She became part of the ever-growing circle of people touched by Catherine's portrait. The first anniversary of Catherine's death approached, and the family faced a decision. The Cancer Center had formally requested to keep the portrait permanently. Other institutions had made offers, museums, universities, even a tech billionaire who promised to make it accessible through virtual reality. Emma found herself back at the Morrison house, now empty and for sale. She sat in the parlor where the portrait had been painted, seeking guidance. In her hand was the letter Catherine had written that last night, still sealed. She opened it with trembling fingers. "My dear ones," the letter began in Catherine's elegant script. "If you're reading this, then, the portrait has begun its work. You're wondering what to do with it, where it should go. The answer is simple: it should go wherever people are remembering how to see each other truly. The portrait is not about me. It never was. It's about the truth that we are all connected, all part of the same story. Every person who looks at it and sees the truth adds to its power. Every act of compassion that results extends its reach. Don't let it become a relic in a museum, not until its work is done. And its work will never truly be done, because there will always be people who need to remember that they are loved, that their lives matter, that they are part of something beautiful and eternal. Trust the portrait. It will tell you where it needs to go." "All my love, always connected," Catherine. Emma folded the letter carefully, tears streaming down her face. She knew what to do. The next day, she met with the Cancer Center board. "The portrait stays," she said. "But, with conditions. It must always be accessible to anyone who needs it, regardless of their ability to pay. And, once a month, it travels to hospices, to community centers, to prisons, to anywhere people are struggling to remember their connection to each other." The board agreed immediately. They had seen the portrait's impact, watched it transform their hospital from a place of mere medical treatment to a center of healing in the truest sense. Thomas Whitfield was invited to the anniversary gathering. He stood before the portrait he had created, marveling at how it had taken on a life of its own. "Do you regret not keeping it?" Robert asked him. Thomas shook his head. "It was never mine to keep. From the moment I finished it, I knew it belonged to something larger than any of us." As the evening progressed, people shared their stories of the portrait. A woman whose marriage had been saved. A man who had found the courage to reconcile with his estranged father. A child who had faced surgery with newfound bravery. Each story added another layer to the legend of Catherine's portrait. But, perhaps the most moving moment came when Marcus, Robert's student with Down syndrome, stood up to speak. He had continued to visit the portrait regularly, always bringing new drawings. "Mrs. C told me everyone is an artist," he said, his words careful but clear. I didn't believe her. But, when I look at her painting, I see what she meant. We're all making something beautiful with our lives. Every day, we add colors to the big picture." He held up his latest drawing, a recreation of Catherine's portrait, but surrounded by hundreds of tiny figures, all connected by threads of light. "This is what I see when I look at Mrs. C's portrait," Marcus continued. "All of us, together, making the world more beautiful. The room fell silent, everyone absorbing the profound truth spoken by this young man whom society often underestimated. Emma felt her grandmother's presence strongly in that moment, could almost hear her delighted laugh at how perfectly Marcus had understood her message. As the gathering ended and people began to leave, many stopped for one last look at the portrait. In the soft evening light, Catherine's painted face seemed to glow with approval, with love, with the eternal truth she had spent her life teaching, that we are all connected, all precious, all part of the same beautiful, ongoing story. The portrait remained at the cancer center, but its influence continued to spread. Reproductions were made and sent to hospitals around the world, though everyone agreed they didn't have quite the same power as the original. Still, they carried something of Catherine's spirit, something of her message. Art historians would later write about the portrait as a unique phenomenon in American art, a painting that transcended its medium to become a catalyst for human connection and transformation. Psychologists studied its effects, theologians debated its spiritual significance, skeptics tried to debunk its power. But, for those who had sat before it in their darkest moments and found light, no explanation was needed. They knew what Catherine had known, that love is the thread that connects all things, that every life touches every other life in ways we can barely imagine, and that death is not an ending but a transformation of that love into something eternal. 5 years had passed since Catherine Morrison's death, and her portrait had become something of a pilgrimage site. The meditation room at the Morrison Cancer Center was booked months in advance, with people traveling from around the world to sit before the original painting. But it was on a cold December morning that the portrait would face its greatest test and reveal its deepest purpose. Dr. Patricia Hendricks arrived at the hospital before dawn, as was her custom. She liked the quiet hours before the day's chaos began, when she could check on critical patients without interruption. But, this morning, she found the meditation room already occupied. A man sat before Catherine's portrait, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Even in the dim light, Patricia could see the gun in his lap. She froze in the doorway, her medical training warring with her human instinct to flee. The man hadn't noticed her arrival, his attention completely fixed on the portrait. Patricia slowly reached for her phone, but something made her pause. The man was speaking, so softly she could barely hear. "I can't do it anymore," he whispered to the painting. "I've lost everything. My company, my family, my purpose. I came here to end it, but..." His voice broke. "But, you won't let me, will you?" Patricia watched as the man stared into Catherine's painted eyes, his body gradually stilling. The portrait seemed to glow in the early morning light, and Patricia could have sworn she saw Catherine's expression shift, becoming more direct, more urgent. "I see them," the man said suddenly, his voice wondering. "In your eyes. I see all the connections. My daughter, she still needs me, doesn't she? Even if she won't speak to me. My employees, they're struggling too. I abandoned them when the company failed. I thought I was protecting them from my failure, but I was just protecting myself." He set the gun carefully on the floor and pushed it away. "You're right," he said to the portrait. "Ending my story doesn't end the pain. It just passes it on, magnified." Patricia stepped quietly into the room. The man turned, startled, but she held up her hands peacefully. "I'm Dr. Hendricks," she said softly. "I help run this place. Would you like to talk?" The man, Jonathan Reed, she would later learn, nodded slowly. Over the next hour, as the sun rose and filled the room with light, he told his story. A tech entrepreneur who had built his company on ethical principles, only to lose it to corporate raiders. A father who had pushed his family away in his shame. A man who had forgotten his own worth when his net worth disappeared. "I've been coming here for weeks," Jonathan admitted. "Sitting with other patients, listening to their stories. I told myself I was trying to find courage to go through with it. But, really, I think I was looking for a reason not to." "And, you found it?" Patricia asked. Jonathan looked back at the portrait. "She helped me remember that my value isn't in what I've built or lost. It's in the connections I've made, the lives I've touched. Even in failure, especially in failure, I have something to offer." That encounter would prove pivotal, not just for Jonathan but for the portrait's evolving role. Jonathan dedicated himself to helping other entrepreneurs who had lost everything, creating a support network that would eventually save dozens of lives. He became a regular fixture at the hospital, often sitting with the portrait, helping others see what he had seen in his darkest moment. But the portrait's influence extended far beyond individual transformations. Emma Morrison, now director of the Catherine Morrison Foundation, had been fielding increasingly strange reports about the painting. Multiple witnesses claimed that the portrait's expression changed depending on who was viewing it and what they needed. A grieving mother swore Catherine's eyes had filled with tears as she wept for her lost child. A young doctor facing burnout insisted the painted face had shown him an expression of such understanding that he had renewed his commitment to medicine. Even more mysteriously, people reported seeing things in the painting that weren't there or weren't supposed to be there. The hidden figures Thomas had painted at Catherine's request seemed to move and shift. Viewers saw faces of loved ones, messages in the brushstrokes, visions of connections they had forgotten. Dr. James Morrison, a physicist and Catherine's distant nephew, decided to study the portrait scientifically. He brought in equipment to analyze the paint, the canvas, even the electromagnetic fields around it. "I expected to debunk the whole thing," he told Emma. "Prove it was just psychology, suggestion, the power of story. But there are anomalies I can't explain." His measurements showed that the portrait emitted an unusual electromagnetic signature, one that seemed to synchronize with viewers' brainwaves. The paint contained standard materials, but they were arranged in patterns that created unique light interactions, making the portrait appear to shift and change in ways that shouldn't have been possible. "It's as if Thomas Whitfield accidentally created a kind of visual technology," James explained. "Or maybe not accidentally. Maybe Catherine knew exactly what she was asking him to do." The 5th anniversary of Catherine's death coincided with a global crisis. A pandemic had swept the world, leaving millions isolated, frightened, and grieving. The hospital had to restrict access to the portrait, but Emma and the foundation board made a radical decision. They commissioned Thomas Whitfield, now in his 70s, to create a series of live painting sessions, broadcast online, where he would recreate the portrait while sharing the story of its creation. The sessions would be interactive, with viewers able to share their own stories of connection and loss. Thomas was initially reluctant. "I can't recreate what happened that day," he protested. "It was a once-in-a-lifetime convergence." "We're not asking you to recreate it," Emma said. "We're asking you to extend it. To help people find their own connections, create their own portraits of meaning." The first session drew over 1 million viewers worldwide. Thomas set up his easel in the same parlor where he had painted Catherine 5 years earlier. The Morrison house had been transformed into a center for art therapy and community healing, but the parlor remained unchanged. As Thomas painted, he told the story of that final day with Catherine. But, more importantly, he invited viewers to share their own stories. A chat moderator read selected messages aloud, and Thomas incorporated elements of these stories into his painting. A nurse in Italy shared how she had printed a copy of Catherine's portrait for her COVID ward, and how patients had found comfort in it. Thomas added a subtle figure in medical scrubs to his new painting. A teacher in Japan spoke of using Catherine's story to help her students understand interconnectedness during lockdown. Thomas painted tiny figures holding hands across a great distance. A grandfather in Brazil mourned that he couldn't hug his grandchildren. Thomas added an ethereal embrace that seemed to transcend physical space. As the sessions continued weekly, something remarkable happened. People began creating their own portraits, not necessarily paintings, but expressions of connection in whatever medium they could manage. Quilts incorporating photos of loved ones, digital collages showing networks of support, even simple drawings by children showing their families as constellations of connected stars. The movement grew organically, spreading across social media with the hashtag #ConnectedPortraits. Hospitals began creating gallery walls where patients and staff could display their own works. Schools incorporated connection mapping into their curricula. Therapists used portrait creation as a tool for healing. Margaret Morrison, still working in crisis zones, reported that even in refugee camps, people were creating connection portraits using whatever materials they could find: charcoal on cardboard, arrangements of stones, patterns drawn in sand.
It's like Gran always said, Margaret told Emma during a rare video call. Everyone's an artist when they're showing truth.
But, perhaps the most profound development came from Marcus, Robert's former student, now a young man with his own art studio. Despite the challenges of his Down syndrome, or perhaps because of his unique way of seeing the world, Marcus had become a celebrated artist in his own right. His portraits didn't look like traditional paintings. They were explosions of color and connection, showing people as networks of light and love. He couldn't always articulate what he saw, but his paintings spoke volumes. "I paint the inside of people," Marcus explained to a documentary filmmaker. "The part Mrs. C showed me how to see." His work was exhibited alongside Catherine's portrait in a special show called Seeing Truly. The opening drew thousands, but it was a quiet moment after hours that proved most significant. Thomas Whitfield stood between Catherine's portrait and one of Marcus's paintings, tears streaming down his face. Emma found him there, lost in contemplation. She knew, Thomas said. Somehow, Catherine knew this would happen. That one portrait would become thousands, that her way of seeing would spread like ripples in a pond. Emma stood beside him, studying the paintings. In Marcus's wild, joyful colors, she could see the same truth Catherine's portrait conveyed, just expressed in a different language. "I've been thinking about that day," Thomas continued. "The thing she whispered to me at the end, about what to add to the painting. She told me to paint doors." Doors? Emma was surprised. This was new information. Tiny ones, hidden throughout the portrait. She said every connection is a doorway, every relationship an entrance to a larger room. "I painted them so small you need a magnifying glass to see them, but they're there." Hundreds of tiny doors. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. Her grandmother's last words about death being just another doorway took on new meaning. As the world slowly healed from the pandemic, Catherine's portrait and the movement it had inspired took on new significance. Psychologists studied what they called the connection effect, the measurable improvements in mental health among people who engaged with connection-based art. A neuroscientist at MIT discovered that viewing portraits like Catherine's activated mirror neurons in unique patterns, literally helping people see themselves in others. The visual representation of interconnectedness seemed to rewire brains toward empathy and compassion. But, for all the scientific interest, it was the personal stories that continued to define the portrait's legacy. Like Sarah Martinez, the cancer patient who had first experienced the Catherine effect. 5 years later, she was not only cancer-free but had become an oncology nurse, keeping a small reproduction of the portrait in her pocket. "When patients are at their lowest, I show them the portrait," Sarah explained. "I tell them my story, but, more importantly, I help them see their own connections, their own reasons to fight." Or like Jonathan Reed, who had come to end his life but, instead found a new beginning. His foundation had helped hundreds of failed entrepreneurs find new purpose, teaching them that success wasn't about individual achievement but about lifting others. "Catherine's portrait saved my life," he said simply. "But, more than that, it showed me how to save others." The portrait continued to travel monthly, as Catherine had wished. It visited prisons, where hardened criminals wept as they recognized their own humanity in Catherine's eyes. It went to schools in underserved communities, inspiring young artists to see beauty in their own lives and connections. It even traveled internationally, briefly, to sites of conflict and tragedy, always returning to its home at the cancer center. Each journey added to the portrait's story. People reported that it seemed to absorb something from each place it visited, becoming deeper, more complex, more universally human. Art conservators studying the painting swore that new details appeared over time, faces in the background that hadn't been there before, subtle changes in the light that revealed new depths. 10 years after Catherine's death, as Emma stood before the portrait on another anniversary, she noticed something that made her gasp. In the corner of Catherine's painted smile, so subtle she had never seen it before, was a tiny self-portrait of Emma herself. But it wasn't the Emma of today, it was Emma as she would become older, wiser, surrounded by the same glow of connection that emanated from her grandmother. "Impossible," she breathed, leaning closer. The image was definitely there, painted in Thomas's distinctive style, but he couldn't have known what she would look like in the future. Unless Catherine had known. Unless she had seen not just the connections of the present but the connections yet to come. Unless the portrait was not just a painting but a promise that the threads of love and compassion we weave in life continue expanding outward, forward, connecting generations yet unborn. Emma understood then why her grandmother had been so specific about the portrait's creation, why it had to be painted on that particular day, by that particular artist, with those particular hidden elements. Catherine had been creating more than art, she had been planting a seed of vision that would grow and spread in ways even she might not have fully foreseen. As Emma left the hospital that night, she passed the waiting room where people sat hoping for their turn with the portrait. Young and old, rich and poor, believers and skeptics, all drawn by stories of transformation, all seeking something they couldn't quite name. She thought of her grandmother's words, "Every life has meaning. Every person has a story worth telling." The portrait had become a mirror in which people could see not just Catherine but themselves, not just one woman's wisdom but the collective beauty of human connection. Outside, the city lights twinkled like stars, each one representing a life, a story, a thread in the vast tapestry of existence. Emma smiled, knowing that somewhere, in hospitals and homes, in studios and schools, people were creating their own portraits of connection, adding their own threads to the design. Catherine Morrison had left behind more than a painting. She had left a way of seeing, a practice of recognizing the sacred in the ordinary, the eternal in the temporal. Her portrait continued its quiet work, person by person, moment by moment, helping humanity remember what it had always known but too often forgot, that we are all connected, all precious, all part of the same magnificent, ongoing story of love. And, in the meditation room at the Morrison Cancer Center, Catherine's painted eyes continued to meet the gaze of seekers, offering the same invitation she had extended in life, to see truly, to love deeply, and to trust in the connections that bind us all together in an unbreakable web of meaning and grace. The portrait would outlive them all, Emma knew this with certainty. It would continue its work long after the last person who had known Catherine personally was gone. Because the truth it conveyed was not bound by time or limited by death. It was as eternal as love itself, as enduring as the human capacity to see the divine in one another. As she drove home through the quiet streets, Emma whispered a prayer of gratitude to her grandmother, to Thomas Whitfield, to Marcus and all the artists who had caught the vision, and to the mysterious force that had woven it all together. The last portrait had become the first of millions, each one a doorway, each one a connection, each one a testament to the beautiful, heartbreaking, sacred truth of being human. The ripples continued to spread, and Catherine Morrison smiled on, forever captured in oils and canvas, forever alive in the connections between human hearts, forever teaching the simple, revolutionary truth that love is the thread that binds all things, and death is just another doorway in the endless mansion of existence.